Welcome to the 12th week of our life group online. I hope you guys are doing well tonight and that things have been going good for you. Our society slowly continues to open different things back up, so hopefully you've been able to kind of experience some of those things again and try to continue returning back to normal or as close to normal as we can get. You know, it's been really nice to be able to have a few in-person worship services now and kind of get us back into the groove of what we've been missing while we've had to be apart. But before we get too much into our Bible study tonight, I had a quick question of the day for us today. And this one's a little bit more related to our study tonight, so not as necessarily fun and exciting as like your favorite cake and things like that. But today our question of the day is, what is your go-to thing that makes you feel safe? So, you know, you hear a lot of times different people have these different comfort items or objects or things they do that kind of help them feel safe when things get crazy. You know, I know my daughter, she's 3, and she has this blanket. It's a penguin blanket, as she likes to call it. And every night before she goes to bed, she wants to sleep with that blanket. So for her, that would be like a security object for her. That'd be something that she finds comfort and safety in. You know, for a lot of us right now, as we go out in public, we may find comfort in wearing a mask. You know, that's an item that we can wear and equip ourselves with that allows us to feel protected from the germs that are all around us and helps us to protect those around us from receiving germs that we may be carrying. But for me, kind of what I go to when I'm seeking safety or comfort is I like to focus on my relationships, whether that be with family or friends. It's really comforting and important to me to know that people who know me and know what kind of person I am and who I am, they, you know, love me nonetheless, and that provides a lot of comfort and security for me. And as a believer, I know ultimately my safety and my comfort can come from Christ and his sacrifice on the cross, which allowed my sins to be forgiven. So there's a sense of hope and a sense of safety and comfort that comes from knowing that his sacrifice has allowed me to be secure in my faith and my relationship with God. So I'm interested to hear some different things that you may turn to or that you may have that bring you that feeling of safetyness or that feeling of comfort that allows you to relax in a potentially stressful time. And this kind of relates to our study tonight because we're going to jump ahead a few chapters or a couple books actually to Joshua chapters 5 and 6. And tonight we're going to look at the Israelites as they attempt to tackle the city of Jericho. And if you know anything about this story, that you know that Jericho is a large walled city, and the Israelites have to find a way to try to, you know, get these current inhabitants of Jericho to flee the country so that the Israelites can enter into the promised land and make their settlements there for themselves. And we'll kind of see what parts of the Israelites in their life that they lean on to find that security and that safety in as they're tasked with this, you know, almost impossible task of scaling and destroying these walls to be able to take over the city of Jericho. So we'll see what they're able to do to try to get this task accomplished. But before we jump too much into that and our chapters for tonight, I want to take just a minute to do a quick recap of where we've been so far in our journey through God's big story. We've been following the Israelites, God's chosen people. And we saw that they found themselves in Egypt, and their time in Egypt ultimately became oppressive. The Egyptians began to make them their slaves and give them these difficult tasks to basically destroy the possibility of Israel overtaking the nation of Egypt. And so once this began to happen, the Israelites obviously cried out to God, asking for some rescue from their oppressors. And the Lord finally sent that. And through Moses and his leadership, the Israelites were able to flee from Egypt. They crossed through the Red Sea on dry ground. And as they finished crossing through and the Egyptians were on their tails trying to catch them to bring them back to Egypt, God allows the waters to go back to where they were and wash the Egyptian army away. And so we see that this kind of marked Israel's exit from Egypt, but their entrance into a period of wandering. And we see that the Israelites wander through the wilderness. They're seeking their new home, the land that the Lord has promised them, and they're trying to make their way to this place that God's prepared for them, but their journey is far from easy. So then we picked up and we saw that God chose to encounter his chosen people on Mount Sinai. And God descended upon this mountain in a big cloud and through thunderous noise and speaking out to the Israelite people, he kind of reestablishes who their God is and just how powerful he is, and also works to reinstate Moses as their leader. As kind of the result from this experience, the Israelites are kind of freaked out about just how big and powerful God is, and they prefer for Moses just to be the messenger instead of God doing it firsthand. And as they leave Mount Sinai, God gives them the Ten Commandments, which become the pillar of what their rules and laws are shaped around, and they're expected to obey these laws as a people group. And then that kind of brings us to where we've been since then. God kind of gave them some more instructions about how to celebrate Passover, and we studied and learned about how God led them through the wilderness by guiding them with a pillar of fire and a pillar of cloud. And so we see that that was a successful journey through the wilderness. Tonight we're going to jump pretty far ahead, and we're going to see where the Israelites have finally made it to the promised land. They have a new leader now, Joshua, and he is taking over this next chapter in the history of the Israelites. And we see that while they're in the promised land and they had a difficult journey through the wilderness, that journey isn't any easier in the promised land, as it's actually already inhabited by other people, and God's given them the task of driving those people out so that the Israelites can settle here and establish their kingdom in this land that he's promised them. So today we'll see them take on one of the first cities that stands in their way, and that's the city of Jericho. And so tonight we'll be in Joshua chapters 5 and 6. So I invite you guys to grab your Bibles so that you can follow along with us. Kirsten's going to read, and she'll be starting in Joshua chapter 5, verse 13.
Joshua 5:13 through 15. The Lord's commander confronts Joshua. When Joshua was near the town of Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him, with sword in hand. Joshua went up to him and demanded, "Are you a friend or foe?" "Neither one," he replied. "I am the commander of the Lord's army." At this, Joshua fell with his face to the ground in reverence. "I am at your command," Joshua said. "What do you want your servant to do?" The commander of the Lord's army replied, "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did as he was told. Joshua 6. The fall of Jericho. Now the gates of Jericho were tightly shut because the people were afraid of the Israelites. No one was allowed to go in or out. But the Lord said to Joshua, "I have given you Jericho, its king, and all its strong warriors. You and your fighting men should march around the town once a day for 6 days. 7 priests will walk ahead of the ark, each carrying a ram's horn. On the 7th day you are to march around the town 7 times, with the priest blowing the horns. When you hear the priest give one long blast on the ram's horns, have all the people shout as loud as they can. Then the walls of the town will collapse, and the people can charge straight into the town." So Joshua called together the priests and said, "Take up the ark of the Lord's covenant and assign 7 priests to walk in front of it, each carrying a ram's horn." Then he gave orders to the people, "March around the town, and the armed men will lead the way in the front of the ark of the Lord." After Joshua spoke to the people, the 7 priests with the ram's horn started marching in the presence of the Lord, blowing the horns as they marched, and the ark of the Lord's covenant followed behind them. Some of the armed men marched in front of the priest with the horns, and some behind the ark, with the priest continually blowing the horns. "Do not shout, do not even talk," Joshua commanded. "Not a single word from any of you until I tell you to shout. Then shout." So the ark of the Lord was carried around the town once that day, and then everyone returned to spend the night in the camp. Joshua got up early the next morning, and the priests again carried the ark of the Lord. The 7 priests with the ram's horns marched in front of the ark of the Lord, blowing their horns. Again, the armed men marched both in front of the priests with the horns and behind the ark of the Lord. All this time, the priests were blowing their horns. On the 2nd day, they again marched around the town once and returned to the camp. They followed this pattern for 6 days. On the 7th day, the Israelites got up at dawn and marched around the town as they had done before. But this time, they went around the town 7 times. The 7th time around, as the priests sounded the long blast on their horns, Joshua commanded the people, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the town. Jericho and everything in it must be completely destroyed as an offering to the Lord. Only Rahab the prostitute and the others in her house will be spared, for she protected our spies. Do not take any of the things set apart for destruction, or you yourselves will be completely destroyed, and you will bring trouble on the camp of Israel. Everything made from silver, gold, bronze, or iron is sacred to the Lord and must be brought into his treasury." When the people heard the sound of the ram's horns, they shouted as loud as they could. Suddenly, the walls of Jericho collapsed, and the Israelites charged straight into the town and captured it. They completely destroyed everything in it with their swords, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, goats, and donkeys. Meanwhile, Joshua said to the 2 spies, "Keep your promise. Go to the prostitute's house and bring her out, along with all her family." The men who had been spies went in and brought out Rahab, her father, mother, brothers, and all the relatives who were with her. They moved her whole family to a safe place near the camp of Israel. Then the Israelites burned the town and everything in it. Only the things made from silver, gold, bronze, or iron were kept for the treasury of the Lord's house. So Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute and her relatives who were with her in the house, because she had hidden the spies Joshua sent to Jericho, and she lives among the Israelites to this day. At that time, Joshua invoked this curse: "May the curse of the Lord fall on anyone who tries to rebuild the town of Jericho. At the cost of his firstborn son, he will lay its foundation. At the cost of his youngest son, he will set up its gates." So the Lord was with Joshua, and his reputation spread throughout the land.
All right, so as we try to dig into Joshua chapters 5 and 6 a little bit more, I have a few questions that we've prepared to try to walk through and kind of talk through and think about in order to help us study these 2 chapters of Scripture a little deeper. So our first question for the night tonight is, what do these verses show us about Joshua's character? You know, chapter 5 ends with this encounter with Joshua and the commander of the Lord's army. And in this encounter, we kind of see a little bit about who Joshua is. We see as he's leading his people through the promised land that he sees this person standing off in their path, kind of impeding where they're headed. And we can see that Joshua is a leader of his people. And not only that, he's an active leader. You know, Joshua could have easily have sent someone else to see who this person was, but instead he takes the role himself to seek out and find out if this person is a friend or if he's a foe. And Joshua approaches and he asks him, "Who are you?" And then we see another glimpse into Joshua's character when this person says, "I'm the commander of the Lord's army." And instantly Joshua bows down and lays down face first in reverence for this person. And we see that not only that, he then, like the kind of soldier type leader that Joshua is, he begins to ask this commander for his orders. You know, he says, "How can I serve you? What do I need to do?" You know, and this just shows that Joshua is the kind of leader who's attuned to God's commands. You know, he's listening and seeking out what the Lord wants him to do. You know, you can imagine some leaders would see this person and realize they're talking to the commander of the Lord's army and want to try to give them a little bit of their ideas of what they need to do as they try to conquer the promised land. But we see that Joshua completely surrenders his leadership role and asks this person to tell him what he needs to do and how he can help serve in the Lord's army. And I think that's really cool, and it really shows us that Joshua was a leader that God chose for the Israelites, and God knew what he was doing when he put Joshua in this leadership role to lead the Israelites into the promised land. And I think as we continue on into chapter 6, we see that Joshua's leadership is vital in them being able to conquer the city of Jericho. So I think these few verses at the end of chapter 5 really show us who Joshua is and kind of why he was the one to succeed such a famous leader of the Israelites in Moses. And Joshua, you know, they didn't lose much when they chose Joshua to be the person to take over after Moses had to surrender his position of leadership. So our next question for tonight is, how would you feel executing this plan that Joshua has been given from God. God says, there's this large city. We know the Israelites have their Lord on their side, and they're a pretty feared military presence just because they've won so many victories in so many battles already. But instead of doing anything like that, he tells Joshua to march around the city 6 times, once a day for 6 days, and to blow the horn as they march around. And then on the 7th day, they need to march 7 times around the city, blowing their horns. And then on the final loud trumpet blow, after they've circled the 7th time, for the whole nation to shout, and the walls would fall down and they could storm the city and God would give them the victory. That's a pretty iffy plan. You have this leader who's known for his military expertise, and this is the kind of plan he presents us with. I'm probably more skeptical in nature, so I'm sure Joshua had many people in his army that kind of doubted the validity of this plan. They're like, are you sure that's what God told you to do? He didn't say like to prepare in some other ways before we march around, or to do anything else. He just was march and make a lot of noise. Like, that's probably not the go-to plan for a lot of the people in Israel's army, but it's the plan that God laid out. And thankfully for the Israelites, they chose to follow God's plan. And so I'm curious to know what you think. Are you one of those people that when someone presents something, no matter how crazy it may sound, you're on board to see where it has to go? I think a lot of times we would like to think we're on board with whatever God's plan is, but a lot of times when it comes to acting that plan out, if it doesn't line up with our plans, then we begin to second guess things. But feel free to share what your thoughts are in the comments below. Let us know, would you be a person that would be all for following this plan, or would you kind of hesitate? Because what's really important about this plan is it doesn't rely on anything that the Israelites do other than their obedience to the Lord. And it shows just how powerful obedience to God can be. God's going to call us to do a lot of things, and we've seen in the life of Israel already that he's called many different people to do some tasks and some things that seem crazy at first. Abraham was asked to sacrifice his only son, and he was willing to do so. And then after he got right to the point where he was about to offer his son, God stopped him, and then God rewarded him by continuing to uphold the covenant that he'd promised to Abraham. And his nation has continued to grow into the nation we're talking about tonight, in the promised land. But there's several other people who, their obedience has been required for them to be blessed. You look at the life of Joseph, and while God was providing for him each and every step of the way, he still had to be obedient everywhere he was and to work hard in order to put himself in the position where the Lord could bless him. And you look at the life of Moses and just all these different people throughout the nation of Israel that have had to continue to be obedient and allow the Lord to bless them and to guide them. And so this point in Joshua chapter 5 and 6 is no different. The Israelites have to be obedient in order for the plan the Lord has for them to be successful. And thankfully for them, they march around. They don't, it talks about they're asked to not even make a sound while they're marching the first 6 times. And then on the last time to not say anything until that last trumpet goes off. And then once it finishes, they're all called to shout as loud as they can. And you can just imagine how difficult that may be while you're walking around this fortified city. And I'm sure, people from Jericho are watching them and possibly even talking to them. They just walk around quietly as these horns blow. It's kind of just a crazy plan, but I'm curious to see what you guys think. What do you guys think about this plan that Joshua had to try to convince the Israelites to follow through with? And then as we continue on, our next question for the night tonight is, what do you think about the end of this chapter? So we see that the Israelites follow through and God gives them the victory, thanks to their obedience to his plan. And then we see that ultimately they keep their promise to Rahab, which was a an inhabitant of Jericho who kept the spies who went in early to kind of scout things out. She kept them safe. And in turn, they promised that when Jericho was destroyed, that she would be spared, her and her family. So they ensured that that promise is kept. But then even after that, once Jericho's been defeated, Joshua levies a curse on anyone who tried to rebuild that city. There was some consequences that were going to come if they tried to reconstruct the city of Jericho. So it's kind of a crazy end to chapter 6. And then we see the last verse of chapter 6 is a statement that says, the Lord was with Joshua, and his reputation began to spread throughout the land. And I just think that that's got to be a really encouraging feeling, an encouraging passage for Joshua. He sees this victory right in front of him take place, and he sees God working. And that has to be an encouraging and a joyous time when he believed in this plan that God gave him. He believed that God would lead and guide him as he took over the leadership position for Israel. And we see him put his trust completely in that. And he sees God following through with things that he promised. He's there as the walls crumble right at the time God told them he would. And it's just got to be really encouraging and kind of like, that feeling like you can do anything. God's on your side, and as long as you're obedient to him and following his plan, your life's going to be successful, and the things that he has in store for you are going to play out. And that just continues to build your faith so that your faith's even stronger than before. So what are your thoughts? What are some of your bigger takeaways from the end of chapter 6? The story of Jericho, it's one that we talk about, with kids all the time, and Joshua and walking around the city and blowing the trumpets. But, there's a lot of significance here. It's really encouraging for us as believers, because a lot of times we can look at the Israelites and their covenant with God, and we can compare that to us today and our covenant with God. Jesus came and established a new covenant. And so realistically, our journey through life looks a lot like the Israelites' journey through life. We're both in a covenant with God, and we both have different things that we're expected to uphold. And so when you read through the Old Testament and this journey of the Israelites, it's comforting to us, and it's encouraging, because we can see that, the Israelites, they made some mistakes during their time, but they also made some good decisions too, and that's encouraging for us. We may slip up here and there, but we know we can make faithful decisions, and we can see the Lord bless those decisions when we choose to follow him and be obedient to him. And so it's encouraging to look at the Israelites and see God provide for them, because that's something that he can do for us today. We're still in a covenant with God, and he loves us just like he loved the Israelites, and he wants to see us be successful. And so we can trust that as we're obedient to him, that he'll be obedient to his promise to us and to lead and provide for us, just like he did the nation of Israel back in the Old Testament. So I just look forward to hearing your all's thoughts about the end of the chapter. If there's anything from this story that sticks out to you, or that's been really encouraging to you over the years, or in a difficult time in your life, feel free to share that down below in the comments. And that kind of concludes the questions that we have for these couple chapters. If you have any additional thoughts or questions, feel free to ask them down below, and we'll try to answer them together and try to learn from each other and our different perspectives. But real quick, I want to take just a moment to kind of wrap up our time tonight and try to leave us with something we can think about and reflect on for the rest of the week this week. So as we wrap up our time together tonight, I just wanted to encourage you guys that in your life, as you go through life, there may be different times when you feel like God's calling you to do something, and it may seem difficult or almost impossible at times, but you can take comfort in the example of the Israelites and this plan as they take down the city of Jericho, that, it probably wasn't any of their first thought game plans to accomplish this task. None of them probably thought that we could march around 7 times and then, the walls would just fall down and we can go in and God will give us the victory, because the people of Jericho will be so confused at what's going on that they won't even be able to function. You know, that's probably not the game plan that anyone was going with, but ultimately it was the game plan that God laid out, and it was the plan that worked to provide the victory in this situation. And that can be true in our lives too. You know, a lot of times we think up these grandiose plans and things that we want to see happen in our lives, and we want things to happen exactly how we want them to happen. And a lot of times God's plans don't line up with our plans. And a lot of times that's for the best. You know, we know one thing's for sure is God's plans are always better than our plans. And while at first we may not think that's the case, as we look back on our life, we can see that plays true more times than not. So I encourage you, as you're going through life, if you're coming to a difficult time and you're not really sure of God's plan that He has for you, and the path ahead looks difficult, I encourage you to, be reminded of the Israelites in this battle of Jericho and how God provided for them and how God's provided for you before in your life, and take comfort in the fact that while His plans may not always seem normal or easy, they're always the best plans. And as we trust Him and we're obedient to the things He calls us to do, that we can trust that He's going to provide for and meet the needs that we have in our lives and see us to the point where He has set for us to be, so that we can bring Him the most glory that we can. And so as we go throughout this week, I encourage you to just reflect on that, to really put your trust in the Lord in each and everything that He's calling you to do, whether it's something you necessarily agree with or if it's something that makes you uncomfortable at times. It's okay to get uncomfortable, but to still be in the Lord's will. That's right where we want to be. So I encourage you, if God's been calling you to do something that may make you uncomfortable, for you to step out in faith and trust Him and strive to do those things and bring Him glory, even though it may be difficult for us to do. So I hope you guys are doing well. If you have any prayer requests or any encouraging thoughts that you want to share with each other, feel free to post them down below this video. We'll all be praying for each other. I know things are still kind of touch and go with the whole virus situation. A lot of people are still not sure about getting out and back to normal just yet, but just know that once you're ready to come out, that we as a church want to help make that process as easy as possible for you. So if you have any concerns about when you return to worship with us on campus, feel free to let us know, and we'll try to do everything we can to make your return to campus as easy as possible. And I encourage you guys this week to really just pray for our country. There's a lot going on right now, and unfortunately at this time it doesn't look like there's a peaceful end in sight anytime soon, but we know, just like the city of Jericho, God works in mysterious ways. So I encourage you guys to pray for our country, pray for the people that are hurting, and just pray that, the Lord would open our eyes as believers and show us different ways that we can kind of step in and help aid and be part of the solution instead of part of the problem. So I encourage you guys to pray for our country and just pray for different ways that we as believers can step into these conflicts and kind of show Christ's love to those around us. So I hope you guys have a great week. Thanks for watching our life group online. I look forward to when we'll be able to meet together and study God's Word in person again. We'll talk to you later. Bye.